All right, today we're going to be talking about chapter 10, which is diversity and equity in the Search for Common Ground book. And I'm Hannah Scott.
I'm Hallie Heaton. And I'm Taylor Munson.
And like I said, this whole chapter was about diversity and equity in the school systems. And Noguera starts by bringing up this whole point of double segregation. And this is segregation based on race and class. And he's talking about how he sees this all across the country, how there are schools specifically with minorities or people who are Black or of Latin America descent, all of these people, that they don't have as good of resources as other schools do. And so he brings up the point that not only are we failing at like Brown versus Board of Education, but also the Plessy versus Ferguson case where it was talking about separate but equal. And his whole thing is that the schools are not equal at all. And he brings up how this is a big issue, especially since the populations of people in like the Black communities or Latin Americans, like all of these people, those populations are increasing and we're becoming more diverse as a nation. But in our education, it's becoming more and more segregated. And he brought up the concern that white people don't even realize this is happening. They don't see this as an issue, or they don't realize that it's happening in their school systems. And part of that is because they're either not in public education, like we've seen a lot of charter schools or private schools, or they just aren't aware. And so that's a big concern that he brings up, and Taylor's gonna talk more about like that racism a little bit later. But another thing that he brings up is how it's not just race. I mean, he talked about obviously like class, the people who are in poor communities, like the schools don't have as many resources. And so that kind of also hinders their ability to learn and gain the best education possible. And he also talked about women in STEM and how that's kind of discouraged. And so all of these things, yes, these kids are going to school, but they're not having an equal chance necessarily at learning. And his biggest concern was that this is the death of the American dream, because even if you're working really hard or going to school, that no longer necessarily means that you have the opportunity to rise in your social class. Like if you're poor, you're gonna go to a school with poor resources, and then you're probably gonna end up poor in the future. And so how that's kind of a big issue and something that this whole chapter tries to address and find solutions to.
So my section was that racism and like anti-racism. They talked a lot about how they mentioned what they call double segregation. So kind of what Hannah was talking about with the equity and diversity of it. Like they're already in a lower class, but then also being segregated based on their race. They talked about how schools are getting more diverse and the teaching staff isn't. And Noguera, he had a really big problem with that. He wasn't very happy about that, and he thought that they needed to have people of the minority groups in teaching positions so that they could have someone to kind of look up to from their own group. He also brought up the point that the majority of the history that we learn is white American history. And so he mentioned that since there's more diversity in the schools now, especially, we should be teaching in more diverse ways. And then to go off of that, for the teachers are white part of it, Noguera, he proposed that some like pre-teaching classes in high school, and that might help kids to be more exposed to that, kids of minority groups, that way that they would want to go into that that they would want to go into the teaching field, and kind of balance out maybe some of those inequalities, like as far as white versus other races, as far as teachers go. And then Hess, he had mentioned that he just didn't want to make white teachers feel less valued, so he thought that maybe we could just teach the white teachers how to connect with their students and integrate their students' cultures in the classroom. He showed some really good statistics about like getting through to those minority groups by showing some of their culture in the classroom. He made a big argument that he really didn't like anti-racism because they kind of use it as like a scapegoat to get away with things that were not necessarily, maybe, I don't know, he just thought that they were like abusing that. He talked about the KIPP charter schools, and they had a like slogan or whatever to work hard, be nice, and they did away with that because they said that it was racist, and he was arguing that he didn't feel like that was true, because if you go somewhere else in different countries, it's not, those working hard and being nice isn't inherently white, and so he thought that that was kind of silly that they brought that up. He also mentioned that he was frustrated that the teachers had been told that they shouldn't give personal details or stories, because that could promote racism, because it would make it seem like success was only only for white people. And so that was kind of interesting. They talked a lot back and forth about that, but really in the end, Hess kind of maybe went a little bit too far as pointing out like specific individuals in the anti-racism movement, and Nogueira kind of just calmed it down and said, hey, we don't really need to talk about the specific things, let's just kind of focus on the big problem here. And yeah, that was pretty much it.
So after that, they kind of work on trying to find solutions and things to these issues that they brought up. One solution that they bring up is the bias training, and they don't really go into explaining this a whole ton, but they both kind of disagree that it's ineffective. They both agree that it is ineffective. They don't like it. That's basically. They don't think that it is going to promote the cultural inclusion that we were trying to look for. And Nogueira talks about how he for many years was involved in organizations, specifically he names one the Inner City Struggle in Los Angeles, that are organizations that try to reach out to the kids that are in these schools that are struggling, and they try to teach them the virtues and teach them these important quality traits that so that they can become better leaders and stuff that the school is not teaching. A few of the things that they name is leadership training and community service and cultural pride, academics, and mentoring and stuff. And so because of that, Nogueira talks about how he was able to see that these kids that was part of the organization, they were able to do so much better in life and actually change stuff in their communities and in their culture, and through the help of these organizations. And so he kind of talks about that this is the path that we need to follow as educators and as the teaching program. We need to look for the things more the leadership and the qualities that come with that to inspire kids to change. And they use the word warrior scholars in this, and they kind of say that it's gonna the change is gonna start with the next generation, and so us as educators, it's our jobs to inspire that that next generation, that they can create the change and they can do better. And then another solution, solution, maybe more of a warning, is just as we go about to not get bogged down by the controversy. Hess really highlights that we need to put more time, instead of fighting each other, we need to put more time just finding solutions and solving the problems, and that if we did that, then we would actually probably be somewhere, but we're not, so we need to do better at that. And they also talk about with the warrior scholars, making an effort in our classrooms to highlight different races and different cultures and different religions to kind of try to unify people more. And throughout this reading, something that really stood out to me, I've got some close family members that are Black and are different races, and it's been really interesting talking to them and hearing their experiences in the educational system and stuff. And they talk a lot about how like my aunts and uncles, when they're raising my cousins and stuff, they're like, whenever you get in trouble with a teacher or like pulled over by a police officer or anything, it's like, yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir, like you are like top, like you are polite and like do not give them a reason to. And I was like, as we were reading this, that kind of stood out to me because it talks about how like a lot of children from different races tend to get disciplined more and tend to get harsher disciplinary consequences. Yeah. And so I was like, that is so interesting. And like I've seen it in my own life. And so I think that like a big thing in like my classroom is just like using my personal experiences and like seeing like the issues that it's caused for my family members and stuff, and making sure that other people don't feel that way in my classroom, and making sure that like we're unified as a classroom.
Something else that they talked about, and there was kind of these after school programs that would give people support, whether they were like poor or of a different race, but how that extra support after school would help these students succeed even if they were from a poor background. And I think that's something that we can apply, and I want to apply to like my teaching, is just giving them extra support even if it's not after school. But I loved that example of just how big of a difference that extra support can make to whatever circumstance that you're dealing with, because I mean the reality is we're gonna face these in our classrooms, whether it's people who are poor, and I mean I love that we're like classrooms are so diverse, and so like meeting all of their needs and bringing in culture, I think that's a big one. I think that's so cool, is like learning different people's culture and making it an educational experience for me and also for the students, and helping the students feel, who are, you know, of diverse backgrounds, feeling welcome and needed in the classroom.
It kind of reminds me back to what we read last week about just them implementing some like specialized classes, some of those like auto classes or things like that, that kind of the students that don't really like do very good in the core subjects, that can be really good for them. I think that that's another example of that support that we can give people. I know in my life I've seen kids that I know like kind of lash out in school and really have a hard time, but I think a lot of it was just the fact that they didn't feel very like wanted or needed at school and like loved and stuff. I feel like some of those other like extracurricular type things in school can really help to give them like a purpose and kind of find their people, their family at school. And so yeah, as far as that goes, it reminded me of the reading last week. And then the other thing that I felt kind of so my great grandpa was full Indian, and so he was Native American, and so I've kind of seen some of the challenges for like him and his children as far as like the racism kind of goes, and I just think it would be really cool if I was able to learn a little more of that. I know when you talk about like Christopher Columbus and everything, you always hear the American side of it, and it would be really cool to like see a little bit more of the other history of our country, because it is important stuff. And so I just think it would be cool like if we were able to teach in those diverse ways like I was talking about earlier, and just kind of everyone would be able to see a little bit different perspectives maybe.
Overall in the reading, like I liked how they kept bringing it back to the problem. Like there was one point where we talked about it where Hess was like kind of got sidetracked on the anti-racism tract, and how Noguera brought him back and was like, no, but we're talking about like, you know, education, and how putting blame on people isn't going to help solve the problem. And I liked that because I feel like politics just gets so heated and like divisive and stuff, and how they agreed more or less on the problem, and so it really is finding the solution. And when we go off into like the anti-racism things, or like when we go to those extremes, that's when it gets really hard to find the solution. When I was reading certain things in the book, I'm like, what? Like, how does this apply? Like, this feels like way off yeah, anyways, so I like that it just kept being brought back, and I think if we can keep that as a focus, I don't know, I really like that. That stood out to me.
Alrighty. We good?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. See you next week.